Okay, welcome everybody. Hello, my name is Kyung Lee and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work as the International Program Coordinator and Advisor at the University of Pittsburgh, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Hasselbein Global Academy virtual summit session entitled Morality and Leadership, Teaching the Next Generation of Leaders. Please note that this session is being recorded. It is paramount that leaders develop a clear set of morals upon which to rely. This session will lead participants through a discussion of morality in leadership within the frame of examples provided from the presenter's past experience as a Hebrew school teacher for 5th and 7th graders. Participants will have the opportunity to consider the differences between their experiences learning about social issues growing up and the experiences of children today learning about these issues. Participants will also reflect upon their own morals and how they impact their leadership styles. Our presenter for this session is Dionna Dash. Dionna Dash is a rising senior at the University of Pittsburgh, studying communications and linguistics. Dionna is a Nuremberg leadership scholar who works closely with the university Jewish community. Dionna writes for the University Jewish Chronicle, teaches at the Joint Jewish Education Program of Pittsburgh, and has served as both the business manager and vice president on the student board of the Hillel Jewish University Center of Pittsburgh. Welcome, Dionna. It's all you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kyung-ah. And hi, everyone. I am Dionna, as she said, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I want to thank you all so much for attending my presentation today. I'm really, really excited to talk to all of you and hear you talk as well. The second half of this will be interactive, so I'm really excited to give you guys a chance to speak as well. So as was said, my presentation is about morality and leadership and teaching the next generation of leaders. I do want to just draw your attention over here for a quick sec. I did put a slight trigger warning on here because later on there is an image that some people might find upsetting. It references some anti-Semitic ideology. So if this is something that is upsetting to you, feel free to just look away or leave the presentation or do whatever you need to do. And also I have this question mark over here because I really encourage you to ask questions. Feel free to unmute and ask, or, do the little raise hand icon or put something in the chat. Whatever works best for you will work for me. So yes, please definitely ask questions. I want to start out today by just making a distinction between morals and ethics, because this is sometimes confused. These two are often used interchangeably, even though they are not quite the same thing. So morals are much more personal and individual. They're opinion-based, and they determine our beliefs, whereas ethics are more societal. These are something we agree upon as a society. These determine rules that we have and therefore the actions that we take. So ethics, a great way to think about ethics are what laws we have, what different laws countries have. So something like stealing, this is something we would consider unethical. We have laws against stealing. And the fact that we have these laws then impacts our behavior. Whereas something like cheating on a spouse, this is something that we may personally consider immoral, but not everyone thinks the same way about this. And there will be no legal consequences necessarily if we cheat on a spouse, but this is something that we might consider immoral for ourselves. This is our own opinion. So why do we care about morals in leadership? Well, we as leaders are often required to compromise that with others that might not have the same morals as ourselves. And in order to compromise, we have to have a firm stance in the first place. We have to know what we believe so that then we can talk about it with someone else and reach a compromise that incorporates both of those beliefs. So we also need to have the tools to develop those stances so that we're able to understand what our morals are on a number of different issues. Our moral viewpoints also will just guide the choices that we make as leaders, especially when we're in tough situations, when we're in crises, or when we do have to compromise, different things like that. We need to have a strong moral background to rely on. So what do I mean when I say teaching our future leaders? Well, this picture on the right here is me at the one time that I got to meet some of my students in person. I promise there were masks. They just made me take it off for the picture. But this past year, I taught at a Hebrew school in Pittsburgh called the Joint Jewish Education Program of Pittsburgh. So for some of you who might not know, Hebrew school is basically like a supplementary school that teaches about Jewish culture, Jewish values, the Hebrew language, different things like that. Some of you may have gone to Catholic school, or I believe there's also like a Chinese school that teaches about Chinese culture, different things like that. So we met every Sunday morning. And I taught 5th and 7th graders, and I taught them Jewish values. And what I love about the school that I taught at was that it in and of itself was already a collaboration. There was already a compromise happening, because the two congregations, the two different synagogues that came together to form the school were Rodef Shalom and Beth Shalom. Now, Rodef Shalom, its members are what we in the Jewish community call Reformed, meaning they are less religious. Their beliefs tend to be less less religious, for lack of a better term. It's more based around spirituality. Whereas Beth Shalom is what we would call conservative, not in the political sense, but rather this isn't like the religious sense. It's just another sect of Judaism. But basically, they are a bit more religious, and they follow different rituals and things like that more stringently. So I love that there was already a compromise of morals that came together to create this program. So what did I teach my students? I told you that I taught them values, but what does that mean? Well, I taught them 7 specific values upon which to base their morals. So these names are in Hebrew, but I'm going to tell you everything that they mean in English. So don't worry, I will keep reminding you what they mean in English. So our first value that we talked about was tshuva, which means repentance. This is recognizing when you made a mistake, admitting it, asking for forgiveness. Then we learned about B'Tselem Elohim. This is the idea that we are all human. And because we are all human, we all deserve equality and we all deserve respect. Then we had Gevura. This is inner strength, courage, bravery. Then we had Achrayut, which is personal responsibility and also feeling responsible for those around us. So a lot of times, B'Tselem Elohim, this idea that, we need to respect everyone and we're all part of the human race, goes with this idea of achrayut and responsibility and being responsible for all the people around us. Then we had a hakarat hatov, which is recognizing the good around us, expressing gratitude for everything in this world. We had koach hadibor, which is the power of words. And this is both words that are written, words that are spoken, and words that are posted on social media. And then finally, we had shalom, which is preserving peace. So these values are very abstract. How do you teach a value? Well, what we would do is we would go over what these values meant, and we would connect them to social justice issues. And something that I really adored about this curriculum was that it didn't just look at these values within a Jewish context. It said, how do these values apply to the world? How do they apply to issues? How do they apply to issues that these students will eventually confront and will probably become leaders about and around? Because as a leader, we are all confronted by certain issues. And if we can rely on these values and how they relate to these social justice issues, then we can form our own stances and make action plans in order to address these issues and hopefully improve upon them for the next generation. So some of the issues we talked about racial justice. We talked about climate change and protecting the environment. We talked about the death penalty and prison reform. And something really important to keep in mind is these students, my 5th and 7th graders, are 10 and 12 years old. These are young kids. These are kids still in elementary school. And they were ready to have these deep conversations about these different issues. Which is something that I'll get into later when I talk about how the younger generation approaches their leadership, because it is quite radical and they are quite advanced and mature for their age. Something else that we talked about was diversity within Judaism, because a lot of times there is a misconception that all Jews are sort of like white Eastern European Jews, and there is a lot of diversity in Judaism, but along with that, there is still a lot of racism and a lack of intersectionality recognized and different things like that. That definitely needs to be addressed within the community. So we talked about different communities of Jews. We talked about Ethiopian Jews. We talked about Indian Jews. We talked about Latinx Jews. We talked about Jews who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and how some of these people who exist in our community, how they are not made, how we don't make space for them, and how this can change. So those were some of the issues we talked about that we connected to our values. And along with that, we talked about different leaders who the students can look up to, who started with the value from the leftmost list, applied it to an issue from the middle list. So some of these leaders that we talked about were Martin Luther King Jr. We talked about Malala Yousafzai. We talked about Clara Lemlich, who, for those of you who might not know, Clara Lemlich was a Jewish garment factory worker in New York City around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and she led the uprising of 20,000, which was a big strike in the garment worker industry. This strike took place not too long after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which killed a lot of workers in Chicago. And many of those workers were immigrants from Italy. A lot of them were Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and women. They died because there were terrible working conditions. There were locked doors, and there was no way to escape a fire that broke out. So Clara Lemlich, she led an uprising to fight for better workers' rights. We also talked about the Jewish Partisans, who were groups of Jewish people during the Holocaust who would hide out in the woods and form armies and fight against the Nazis. And one of the most famous groups is the Bielski Brothers, who were led by four brothers. And so this is just a picture of them there. So we talked about all these different leaders, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who had really embodied these values and used them to come up with moral stances that they then applied to social justice issues. So I definitely taught my students some things, but they also taught me quite a bit. They taught me a lot about their generation and how they approach their leadership and how amazingly advanced they already are. And I think one of the reasons that they're so advanced, and I will get into examples of their leadership later so you can see for yourself just everything that they're already doing. But I think one of the main reasons that they're so advanced is because they learn about social issues differently than many of us did growing up. And what I mean is they truly just lack the luxury of ignorance. I think, personally, and I'm sure some of you might relate to this, but personally, when I was younger, when I was 10, 12 years old, I was aware of social justice issues, but I was not acting on them. And I definitely didn't understand their full scope. And I was definitely blissfully unaware of quite a few of them. These kids, they don't have that because they have a much more direct experience with social justice issues, with violence and inequality, especially with social media. People, can post videos and share their experiences of, the terrible prejudices that they face. And so through social media, they learn about different causes to support and different injustices that are occurring. And just within their own community, these students were present for the Tree of Life massacre, the synagogue shooting in October, on October 27th of 2018, just 3 years ago. These kids are part of the Jewish community in Pittsburgh. This was an attack that killed 11 people within their own community. A lot of my students had family members, had friends who belonged to the 3 different congregations that were attacked that day. So, any sort of sense of, I think, innocence is what we tend to consider it, of this unawareness. They're not afforded that. And not only them, but really all the children in their generation. So this is the triggering image over here on the left. So if you feel like you need to look away, please do so. So some of the challenges of teaching, because it was not without its challenges. As I'm sure some of you relate, whether you're students, teachers, working virtually, whatnot, is the virtual reality of this past year. So virtual teaching required me to accommodate different learning styles, and not only that, but different leadership styles, because so much of our curriculum was based around morals and values and teaching these students to be leaders and embrace that leadership spirit within them. Was recognizing that some students are ready to get up and lead a protest, but how do they do that in a virtual world? And was recognizing that some students would rather, write a letter to their representatives in Congress, which is definitely something they could do in a virtual world. So it was sort of trying to locate different people's leadership styles and how they could still facilitate those different kinds of leadership within this virtual world. It was also my first time teaching this class and this curriculum. I'd taught in a Hebrew school before, but I hadn't taught Jewish values like this. So just as the students were learning about this, I was also learning. And when we would do our discussions about morals, um, it involved me also figuring out what my own morals were. So I was learning right alongside them. There were also a lot of breaks in the curriculum to discuss the social justice issues because the students asked about them. Once again, they really wanted to discuss serious things that they saw in the world, issues that were affecting them. They wanted to talk about it. They're ready for those conversations. And I think a lot of times we almost tend to talk it down to people who are 10 years old. My fifth graders were not having it. They wanted to have mature conversations. And I think honestly, both them and I learned so much more because of that. There was also one of the biggest challenges was reckoning what we'd been learning about morals and leadership with what was really happening in the world, because these morals are very idealized, and it's one thing to say I have a stance on something and I recognize other people maybe don't have that same stance, and it's another to see current events happening and be very disheartened by it. So an example of this was the Capitol riot, for those of you who might not know. On January 6th, there was a group of people, many of whom I think it's fair to say had neo-Nazi ideology and held many other prejudices. And that group of people attacked the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., raided the building, different things like that. This picture of this man here on the left was one of the people who was part of that. So a lot of these people were wearing had flags or were wearing clothes or different emblems that had a lot of anti-Semitic and racist and prejudiced ideology plastered upon them. So this was an image that was spread around on social media. This was an image my students saw. And then the next Sunday when they came in for class, uh, they wanted to talk about it. They brought it up and they said, how do we take all this that we've been learning about, respecting everyone and equality and everyone being human, and then look at these people, spouting off talk about people being inferior and different things like that, and attacking our capital. So this was a time when their idealized values were tested in a real situation. So some of the things we talked about that day after the Capitol riot was we talked about tshuva and admitting mistakes, and how sometimes if you as a leader can admit a mistake, it can affect other people and make them realize um, that maybe they have made a mistake as well, or maybe could encourage them to not take certain actions or to take certain actions. We talked about personal responsibility and achrayut and supporting everyone around us. And unfortunately, that includes supporting people who maybe don't support you. This was something that my students really struggled with B'Tselem Elohim and achrayut, these ideas of personal responsibility and being responsible for the people around you, and also, everyone's human and deserves respect, was how do we give equal rights to people who view us as less than equal? And I think that this is something that we're all going to face at some point in our lives. Obviously, um, there are people who have a lot more power. There are people who have a lot more privilege, and they may not face this as much. But it is something that we need to recognize and we need to address, that there are many people who view others as less than equal, and yet we are still encouraged to give them equal rights. And this is something hard to reckon with. This is something hard to sit with. And this is something that 5th and 7th graders were struggling with, as I'm sure all of us are probably still struggling with. So something that we talked about was fair trials. I think this is a wonderful sort of framework in which to consider this, because we talked a lot about actually the Nuremberg Trials, which were the trials that took place after the Holocaust, the trials for Nazis and Nazi leaders. So they had committed a terrible genocide, and then they stood trial. And I remember I had one 7th grader who she just couldn't understand, and she kept saying, when we talked about this, why didn't we just like throw them in jail? Like, why did we give them a trial? Like, weren't they all just going to be found guilty? Like, what is the point? And I think there's a very valid point, right? What is the point? They've committed a horrible genocide, and are we just going to give them a trial? Well, the point is that we are giving them the rights that we would have wanted. Even if, every outcome of that trial is going to be that they are found guilty, we are still showing them that we are giving them some respect by even affording them a trial. We're saying we're not going to treat you as less than equal like you treated us. And I think that this is something hard to sit with. I'm sure some of you disagree with that, and that is fine. But this is where we go back and we rely on our morals, and we think, is this a moral that I want to uphold in every situation? Or is this a place where I say this crosses the line, and I'm not going to give equal rights to those who view me as less than equal? This is something we have to personally decide for ourselves. So some examples of my students' leadership throughout the year, and this just goes back to how wonderfully advanced they all are. Their whole generation is, I'm sure. They crafted a letter to Congress about animal rights. They were very, very passionate about animal rights. They had certain different issues that really spoke to them. And so one of them was animal rights, and they wrote a letter to Congress about that. I also had a student named Molly, a 7th grader, who was just amazing. And she used to live in Nevada. And back when she was living in Nevada, there was a housing crisis where a lot of families couldn't afford housing. There was a lack of affordable housing available. So she actually went to Carson City, the capital of Nevada, and she lobbied her local senator about that, which is amazing. If you think about, I don't know how old she was at the time, but maybe 10 or 11. If you think about like an 11-year-old lobbying a senator, this is really something. They also would constantly send around change.org petitions, try to get each other to sign them and to donate. One that they loved to send around was the one protesting the price of insulin and how high it had gotten. Some of them had family members with diabetes, so this was something that really spoke to them. And I love that they were acknowledging issues within their own families, within their own communities, within the larger world, and really encouraging each other to be aware of these issues and to act to improve them. A lot of my students attended Black Lives Matter protests with their families. This was another thing I noticed, was a lot of these students came from families who had parents who really wanted their children to be aware of issues and to act on them. And I just think, this is an example of that, is a lot of these families went to different protests. And also, just on a smaller scale, but something that I still think is important to acknowledge, is my 7th graders asked me to create both president and vice president positions for the class. They wanted to take on more leadership roles just within our small little class, which I thought was wonderful. They actually wound up doing some work and took a little bit of stress off me. So that was great. And they wrote their own speeches and they organized a time to give them, and they organized a fair vote, which I thought was a wonderful exercise for us to discuss voting rights. And along with that, with their positions, one of the main things that I tasked them with was I asked them to come up with some discussion questions, to take the values, connect them to an issue, and then come up with some discussion questions. So that was another way that we got to really talk about what was interesting to them, what issues they cared about. And I think that that generated a lot of talk about things that I may not have known that they wanted to discuss before. So this is the letter to Congress that they wrote. They haven't sent it yet, but this was written by my 7th graders, and in their 8th grade year, I actually know the teacher. So her and I have discussed them sort of taking these next steps that they wanted to do, and then hopefully sending that letter. I really hope they will, because I want to show them that they do have a voice, even though they're only 12 years old. They still have a voice and can make a change. So I guess I'll go ahead and read this to you. Dear Congress, we are a group of concerned students. We believe that animals should have a safe environment in which to live out their lives. In order to facilitate this, we urge you to consider legislation about the following issues: a bill protecting the rainforest from further damage and protecting other habitats, a bill restricting zoos from removing unendangered healthy animals from their natural environments, a bill encouraging the protection of endangered species, specifically by transferring them to safer environments, a bill enforcing stricter laws against animal poaching and hunting, especially of endangered species, a bill enforcing stricter consequences for animal abusers, a task force to help clean up trash from animals' habitats, including oceans, a task force ensuring that animals raised for food purposes are being treated and raised fairly and morally. This legislation is necessary because animals provide food for us. We need to live in harmony with them. And we as humans are tasked with protecting animals who might not be able to protect themselves in all situations. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Jacob, 7th grade. All of these ideas came from research that they did on their own. I helped with grammar a bit, but that's really all I did. So, you can see all these different concerns that they had. They didn't just, sort of come at this with the approach of like, oh, animal rights, but they specifically looked into different issues around that. So their next steps were they wanted to talk to experts to help inform them about some of these issues and any more that they might have missed, and also to add some support to their letter. They wanted to start a petition and get people to sign it to fight for some of these things. And they also wanted to send this letter to Congress. So hopefully that will happen this next year. So now is the interactive part. Thank you for bearing with me through that first half. So now we're going to talk about some specific questions of morality and leadership. And these are actually questions we discussed in my class with my 5th and 7th graders. And I think they really work for all ages, though, because I think that they're tough questions that don't just have simple answers and are something that you can keep returning to. So I have a bunch here. I don't know if we'll get through them all, but I will go ahead and read this first one to you, and then I encourage you to unmute and just talk. Again, use the little raise hand emoji only if you want to. You can also just unmute and talk. I really don't mind. You can use the chat. I'll pull that up so I can see it. And I just love if we could have some open discussion. But this first question here is with the theme of B'Tselem Elohim, which again is this idea that we're all human, and we all deserve respect, kindness, and basic human rights. So the question we discussed was, should we respect people who do bad things? Now, bad things, right? This covers a giant range of contexts. We discussed this in a number of them. We talked about, schoolyard bullies and your basic, 5th grade drama, all the way up to Nazis and Nuremberg Trials, like I had talked about before. So what I would love is if we could think about people that we might have to interact with on a daily basis. Who, or people in the news or something like that, who we consider to have done bad things. And I'd love if we could think about, where is this line? How much do we respect someone? How far do we let someone go before we lose this respect for them? Is there a point in which we lose respect? What if they don't respect us? Do we still respect them? So I'd love if we could think about some of these questions around respect and where is this line. I'm going to go ahead and open our chat and see if anyone has said anything. Again, also feel free to just unmute. I'll give us a minute to collect our thoughts.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, sorry, I have a monitor up, so it's like I'm looking up.
No,
But
no worries.
basically, the question kind of reminds me of some of the morality in superhero movies, and I think that's interesting because, in part, popular culture, in parts, basically influences us to kind of learn about these morals and to kind of they can be applied into these ethical situations. So in superhero movies, usually the superhero probably could kill the villain or something. I mean, it's all a movie and it's all a situation that's made up, but they don't kill villains unless needed because of basically the higher morality of treating everyone with basic human rights. So I think that's what really applies to this question in this situation, that we should respect human rights even if the person being persecuted doesn't. It also reminds me really quickly of siblings. Just because your sibling pokes you in the stomach doesn't mean you have the right to poke them in the stomach. My parents always kind of made me ignore my brother and then just be mature about it since I'm older and stuff. And it was never a legitimate reason to yell back at him or do something back to him just because he started it. So that's kind of my reflection on this question.
Yeah, wonderful. Those are both great points. Thank you. Another question that I didn't include here, but that my students and I did discuss are if fictional heroes, or if fictional characters can be considered heroes in the same way that we would consider some of the leaders we had studied to be heroes. And I think the consensus was that yes, because they do teach us some important lessons like that. And they also have their own set of morals that we can look upon and take a note from. So definitely, and there is a later question here. I don't know if we'll get to it, but it's sort of about morals in wartime and how different situations affect different morals, and how even different ethics as well. We talk about wartime ethics versus sort of quotidian ethics. So this idea of we don't kill a villain even if they were trying to kill us is definitely something that I think can walk that line as well. But you're right, we can definitely take note from superheroes and from popular culture, and it is definitely influencing the way that these children view things, because this is the sort of media they're receiving. Thank you so much. And let's see, I have a message here. Melina, do you mind if I read this? Is that all right if I read out loud? Okay, great. Melina said, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She said, I think you first have to understand their perspective and take a step back. What you get from that experience can determine your answer. If you can understand why they did what they did and forgive them, I think you can still respect them. If it is beyond your comprehension based on your morals, then respecting them at that time may not be possible or healthy for you. I think this is a wonderful point as well. I like you're sort of saying I need to be able to understand what the other person was thinking to even be able to reason with them on a human level. Um, yeah, it sounds like you have a set idea about how you would react in situations. One of the things I love about your response is it applies to a number of situations. Right? I think it's very easy for us to say, oh yes, I will respect every single person, every single situation. And then a tough situation comes up and you're like, well, maybe not this one. But it seems like yours can apply to lots of different situations. Um, which is wonderful. You have a good game plan. Seems like you've developed some strong morals around this upon which to rely. All right. Does anyone have any final comments on this question? Okay, wonderful. Then I will go ahead and move on to the next one. So this is about achrayut, which is personal responsibility. There is a saying in Hebrew, Kol Yisrael arivim ze bazeh, which means all Jews are responsible for one another. But in our class, we really just extended this to all people, right? All people are responsible for one another. So there are two separate questions, but the first one here is, do you agree that we're all responsible for each other, or are there situations in which it should be every man for himself? This is another one where I think it's easy to just say, oh, of course we should all support each other all the time. And then sometimes you're faced with very tough situations and you feel like you need to defend yourself first. And maybe another way to think about this, which I have been puzzling with myself lately, is with mental health. I don't know how many of you were in the earlier session about burnout, but I think there can often sometimes be this idea of I'm working for a company, or I'm working with a group of people, or it could even be family, right? I'm doing things for my family, and everything I'm doing is supporting them, and so it's important. But at what point do you compromise yourself and your own mental health and your own stress and everything like that? So I'd love if we could take a minute to just think about this and think about our own approach to being responsible for everyone. If anyone has any comments, once again, chat, unmute, whatever you want. And thank you so much for your participation. I know you're probably tired by now.
I know it sounds selfish, but I think first you have to think about yourself and what's best for you, like being responsible for yourself and what you can mentally and physically handle, because you can't do any good for anyone else if you're not fully at your best and taking care of yourself. So we're responsible for ourselves, and then maybe not responsible for others, but out of human decency and empathy, do what you can for others and don't leave people hanging by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that your comments being supported in the chat, you can't pour from an empty cup. Right. You can't give of yourself if there is nothing left to give. So yeah, and I think you're right. I think we definitely have, especially work culture in the United States has this idea of, work as hard as you possibly can, then focus on yourself, right? Don't put yourself first. Putting yourself first is selfish, everything like that. So I love that within our generation, we're starting to sort of correct this thinking, and hopefully in the younger generation, they're having some similar ideas as well. I'm going to go ahead and skip the second question because I want to get to this one instead. And see, we have about 5 minutes left. So this will be our last one that we do real quick here. But this talks about gevurah, which again was that inner strength, courage, different things like that. I don't know why we're reloading, but this one starts off with a Torah story, which I would just like to paraphrase by saying that we just use these stories as sort of like a reference. We don't necessarily believe that they happened. It's not required that our students believe any of the things that we learn about. It's just more so like a guideline, like a fable would be, like an Aesop's fable. So there's a story that when Israel was at war with the Canaanites, there was a woman named Yael, an Israelite woman, who killed Sisera, who was the commander of the Canaanite army. So after his troops were defeated by the Israelites, Sisera fled and tried to find a place to hide out to avoid the Israelite soldiers from finding him. Yael welcomed him into her tent and promised not to tell anyone he was there. As Sisera slept under the guise of protection, Yael killed him with a hammer to his head. What Yael did required courage and strength, but is morally ambiguous. And this is sort of our wartime ethics question here. Were Yael's actions moral? Were they necessary? And does necessity impact morality? I think is my main question here is, does necessity impact morality? Are there situations in which something has to be done that maybe crosses our own lines of where we have our morals, but is something that we feel is more necessary. Which one outweighs the other, necessity or morality? So if anyone has any thoughts about that, that'll be our last little bit here. Go ahead and give you guys some time to think. Open up the chat again. And as you are thinking about that, I'm going to go ahead and skip here to the end. Let's see, we have a comment from Alina. Thank you again for all your comments. I think we believe things are necessary too quickly and make rash decisions based on our morals that may ultimately be conflicted with our other beliefs. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of times we can feel a little bit of that stress, that sort of adrenaline rush that comes with a crisis, and we think, oh my gosh, I have to handle this immediately. And certain things in the moment feel very necessary, and then later when we're reflecting, we may feel a lot of guilt because maybe we did something that doesn't align with our morals. So definitely understand the rash decisions, right? And conflicting, I like how you said conflicting with our other beliefs, right? Because morals really are the basis of our beliefs. And if we break those morals, then we're really not acting out who we truly are. So, all right, if anyone has any last comments, feel free to pop them in the chat. But if not, I just want to say, I know we're basically at time here. So I want to say thank you so much. If you have any questions or anything, you can email me here at the address on the screen. And just thank you again so much. I really appreciate your participation and your listening and everything.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really want to thank Dionna for their presentation this afternoon. Thank you as well to all of the participants who have joined us today. At the conclusion of the summit, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. We ask you that you please complete the survey at your earliest convenience to share some feedback about your learning experience today. At this time, we encourage you to transition to your next session using the Zoom links, which are located in the summit program. Thank you very much again, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.